The name of this session is The Human Costs of Iraq and Other Wars. My name is Donna Mulhearn. I am not an academic, I'm an activist, and so I'll be speaking from that point of view. I've been invited by the organisers to share a little bit of my experiences and my journey as an activist, especially my journey alongside the people of Iraq, which has allowed me to experience firsthand the human costs of war. So I was part of the Human Shield movement back in 2003. Now, I think probably most of you have heard of the Human Shield movement. I was very pleased back then to note that we had many Japanese human shields with us. And there was one in particular who stayed at the same site that I did. Her name was Yukiko. So everyone I meet from Japan, I ask them, do you know Yukiko? Because I'm sure everyone in Japan knew Yukiko because the Japanese media called 24 hours a day to speak to her. Hello, mushi, 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 mushi. All I wanted was Yukiko, so I was sure she was very famous back in Japan. But we had, I can think of at least a dozen Japanese human shields, a very strong contribution from Japan, which was wonderful. The Human Shield movement was a spontaneous response to the impending war in Iraq. The idea came from a guy named Ken O'Keefe, who was a former US Marine. He had fought in the 1991 Gulf War, and as a result of his experience there, he was quite traumatised. He became an anti-war activist, and he had the idea, which is not a new idea, but an idea that he revived for these times, and that was the use of white privilege, the use of us from the West going to a place where the lives of the other people aren't considered as valuable as ours. In other words, it seemed okay. Western governments thought that it might be okay to bomb Iraqis because they are Arabs and Muslims. But if we sent people over there whose names were Mary and John and Donna, well, wouldn't that be a public relations disaster? And so we went in our hundreds. The call went out, mass migration to Iraq. We will try to stop the war. We will make it impossible for them to bomb. Of course, that didn't happen. We were about 800 to 1,000 in total. That was over a period of about 2 months. People were coming and going all the time. At one stage, I think the largest group was about 300. We had everyone from every background and all ages and persuasions. The youngest was 19, a Spanish university student from Barcelona. The oldest was 82, an American woman from the southern states of America. And we had everything in between. And we didn't just have hippie radical socialists, we had monarchists. I remember Godfrey, a 75-year-old British monarchist who loved the Queen. And he boasted of it. He was also a devout Christian, as many of us were. Our faith led us to Iraq because we come from a very radical teaching, in my tradition, radical Christian tradition of non-violence and expressing that. And so we had anarchists, and we had communists, and we had Trotskyites, and we had Buddhists, and we had people of all religions and beliefs and persuasions, so we could not be put into a box in any way. We had them coming from all countries, African nations, European countries, everywhere from Iceland to Korea, Australia, the Pacific, everywhere. We wrote to George Bush and we said, "Dear Mr. Bush, we are the Human Shields, we come from all these different countries. We are going to live at these sites in Baghdad, which are important humanitarian sites for the people of Iraq during war. They had been identified by the UNDP, the United Nations. We asked them to choose the sites. They were also sites that had been targeted previously in other wars in the 1991 Gulf War. We said, Mr. Bush, if you bomb these sites, you will kill us. And we sent off the letter, hoping that the fax machine worked, because we really wanted them to know, the Pentagon to know where we were. And so we stayed for the duration of the war, and so one of the goals of the Human Shields was to protect these sites from bombing. And a lot of cynics said at the time, a lot of cynics in the media, there are so many of them, said, oh, but as if they would have bombed those sites. As I said, well, they did previously, so we weren't going to trust their word again. And one example is that of the communication centre in Al Mansour. We had human shields based there because the Iraqis wanted their telephones to be available during the war to phone ambulances and to contact each other. And so we had human shields there for the first 5 or 6 days of the war, and we were amazed that we were still able to get phone calls. But then many human shields had to leave, which left one woman there on her own. And we pulled her out because we didn't want a woman there on her own during the war. Within 8 hours of her evacuation, the site was hit by a missile and blown to pieces. And so we see that as an example of the power of the human shields. And the Iraqis were amazed that that site survived for so long. Of course, the other functions of the human shields were just as important, and they were bearing witness to war, to be there to see firsthand what was going on, so we could speak the truth through the media spin and balance what was coming through the corporate media and through our governments, and that was a very valuable role to take. The other role, of course, was to show solidarity to our fellow human beings and our brothers and sisters, the Iraqi people, which I believe is very important. So although we come to this session to discuss the human costs of war, my interest as an activist is not just to discuss it and leave the room having discussed it, but to decide how are we to respond and how are we to minimise the effects of these most terrible costs of war. And I believe non-violent actions such as the Human Shield movement are examples of that. There's been some talk already about that there are not many non-violent alternatives at the moment. I would disagree with that. I believe there is enough intellectual capacity in this world to create and dream and implement enough non-violent alternatives to war than this world needs. We have the capacity to do so. The question is, do we have the courage? And do we have the people willing to go and implement these plans? Because if we are serious about non-violence and peace, then we must take the same risks for peace as we do for war. And so this is the question before us.